In this week's lesson, we're going to be discussing Baptists in America from 1800 to 1845. This is a time when Baptists become united for missions. It was a period of time after the Revolutionary War, when the war was over and people were coming together, and America was growing in lots of ways. They were growing in commerce and growing in trade, and America was on the rise in lots of ways. And during this time, Baptists began to come together and form missions. So during the time of 1800 to 1845, three great societies formed: the Society for Foreign Missions, the Tracts and Publications, and the Home Missions. So on May the 18th, 1814, the General Missionary Convention, the Baptist denomination, got together and formed what's called the Triennial Convention, which simply means it was a convention of Baptists meeting and sending delegates to a convention every 3 years for the purpose of doing foreign missions. The first delegates were mostly from the North, with only 9 from the South. President Richard Furman was from the South in the Charleston area. There were several developments which prepared for this important new Baptist organization. Number one was the awakening missionary zeal in England and America. So the Great Awakening had happened, and the Second Great Awakening was taking place, and missionary zeal was really high in England and America, so that began to make Baptists come together to spread the gospel. Also during this time, there's some students at Williams College in Massachusetts, which were led by a man named Samuel Mills, met for prayer and discussion concerning missions. This group was called the Brethren, and they began to meet there around Williams College, simply to pray about missions. This came to be called the Haystack Prayer Meeting. Luther Rice was one of these brethren, and he was gathering around together and praying. He was not necessarily part of the Haystack Prayer Meeting in itself, but he was one of the brethren who were discussing and speaking and praying on missions. And during that prayer and during his prayer and discussion, Luther Rice decided that God had called him to take the gospel to the heathen. Adoniram Judson at this time also felt the call for missions, and so he goes off to India. So you got Luther Rice and Judson both, and these men sent out of the Brethren, and because of this prayer meeting, are going to India and around the world to do missions. Judson, by the way, while he was on the way to India, translated the Greek New Testament, was reading the Greek New Testament, and realizes that salvation by grace through faith and baptism, belief and baptism are the way we come into Christ. And he rejected infant baptism and became a Baptist on the way over. Judson actually came back because of that belief, and with integrity, told all of his supporters who had supported him before he became a Baptist that he had changed and didn't believe in infant baptism, and then raised new support from people who agreed with him. So Luther Rice and Adoniram Judson were a big part of Baptist and the beginning of the Triennial Convention and the beginning of foreign missions. So basically, the Triennial Convention and the foreign missions, or the Northern Baptist Convention, or again the Triennial Convention, basically was formed as a local society to help the Judsons. In other words, they formed together to help the Judsons when they had become Baptist, and Luther Rice helped form a number of these mission societies. In the midst of all this, Rice conceived of a plan to draw delegates from these groups to form one nationwide missionary society. So societies reformed around the Judsons, and Luther Rice formed other societies, and these societies, Rice conceived of a plan to bring all these societies together and have a nationwide missionary society. So Rice's plan came to fruition at the Triennial Convention of 1814. So again, we'll talk a little later about this societies and conventions, but we've been using the term society versus convention. So let's talk just a minute about the difference between a society, a missionary society, and a convention. Because, as I said, Luther Rice formed various societies, and he conceived of a plan to pull together all those mission societies that he had formed into one nationwide mission society, and they called it the Triennial Convention. So what's the difference between a convention and a society? Well, a society, which is mostly preferred by the Northerners, involves voluntary participation of interested individuals. So, for instance, if I want to go to India, I form a missionary society. I may call it the Scott Thompson Missionary Society. And I begin to seek support for me, for my society. And I go to individuals and ask them to support me, or I go to churches and they support me. So I get different churches to support me and different individuals to support me, and they all support my society. And so the society model is formed around these individuals or individual churches supporting one person or one missionary group going out. Some of the reasons that people prefer society is they say it's simpler. It doesn't require denominational machinery. It maintains a more local control. It has more of a committed membership when you got a hands-on with that one person you're supporting. Does not enlist involvement with other churches. In other words, if I support a society or my church supports a society, I'm not asking other churches to help me. I'm doing that, and I can give until I decide not to give. It never builds denominational identity and loyalty. It makes overall denominational planning and correlation difficult. So those are some things that society does that some would call it detraction. In other words, societies may not work because it destroys identity and loyalty among other churches. It makes denominational planning and correlation between churches more difficult. The convention model, or the association model, on the other hand, is based upon churches which send messages and contributions to a central body to plan and carry out ministries beyond the local church. So a convention is a group of churches coming together and sending money to one central location, and out of that location, that administrative group there executes the missions that the convention body, the churches, come together and decide to do. So if you have a convention, then 10, 20, 100, 1,000 churches come together and form a convention, and they meet yearly or every 3 years, and that convention, the churches send delegates to that convention, and that convention decides through a vote what missions they want to support, and the missions that are supported through that convention are the monies that come from all the churches support those missions that all the churches decided to support. Some good things about a convention model is it enlists other churches together. It also builds denominational loyalty among churches of like mind. It allows correlation and balance between the various causes sponsored. In other words, you don't have a bunch of different mission societies out there. You have correlation where you're not overlapping. It preserves the autonomy of the local church while providing centralization. In other words, in a convention model, the local church is still autonomous. It's not like a bishop-driven Episcopal denomination. We have no head bishop. Your church is still autonomous. Your church just decides to support the missions with these other churches. A church can withdraw at any time, and the church still chooses its own pastor and is autonomous, but it just comes together with other churches to pool money toward a singular mission cause. Some of the problems there that people have with convention model is sometimes the voting members have greatest interest in just one cause, and other voting members sometimes get voted out. So their ideas get voted away. So those are some problems. As far as the Triennial Convention goes, it was on a society model. So in the North, the societal model was preferred. There are three factors in the South which really causes the South to favor the convention model. Number one, the South was more influenced by General Baptists who favored a strong denomination, so convention model fostered denominational loyalty. Also, the Philadelphia Association, which was a convention model, was heavily influential on the South. They influenced guys like Daniel Marshall and the Shubal Stearns. Also, the rapid growth of separate Baptists in the South helped centralize the South, and those things helped the South favor more of a convention. The social conditions also. New England was more democratic and would tend to sponsor a society because they wanted to sponsor who they wanted to from their local church. The South, society-wise, was more centralized on what's called a feudal plantation, and that worked on more centralized ideas. So that's some social conditions that may have influenced this. So as I said a moment ago, the Triennial Convention eventually reverted to the society approach. Now, not only did the Triennial Convention support foreign missions through the convention, but also the Baptist General Tract Society. This is a time when tracts were printed, gospel tracts, all kind of tracts were set out, and printing was going on. And so Baptists began to support tracts. Also, the American Baptists there in the Triennial Convention supported not only just foreign missions, but home missions. Planting churches in the West, planting churches in the South, planting churches all around for home missions at home. Now, during this time, there was discord among Baptists, and there were two movements among the Baptists that created discord. One was the anti-missions movement. Particularly in the North there, you had some that were hyper-Calvinists who believed that salvation was God's work alone, and that missions and conventions are human inventions alone, and we should not send anybody to preach the gospel. That's God's work, and we should not use means or methods to do that because that's the power of God's grace. And there were a certain small group of people who were so Calvinistic in their approach, hyper-Calvinistic, that they didn't do that. And we saw in the last lectures that many Calvinists didn't follow that. But you had some who said there was no need to do missions because salvation is God's work alone. And we know that God, in His sovereign grace, uses people to preach the gospel. And so we disagree with that, but there was this discussion and discord among Baptists. There were four men that were part of the anti-missions movement: Daniel Parker, John Taylor, and Joshua Lawrence. Another man, Alexander Campbell, was part of the anti-missions movement, but Campbell started another controversy of his own, and that's the second controversy that created discord among Baptists. It's called the Campbell controversy, or the Campbellites. And that was began by a man named Alexander Campbell. He came out of Scotch-Irish Presbyterianism and became a Baptist. He had more rationalistic views of faith. Campbell believed in baptismal regeneration. He did not believe there should be denominations. He believed we should be just Christians and no denominations. Some of the things that Campbell believed is he believed that saving faith is intellectual and not a change by the heart of God. In other words, he didn't believe in God's grace working in a person's life and changing them. He believed being saved was just intellectually assenting to the gospel and you were saved, and that you had to follow baptism. In other words, he did not believe that salvation was complete unless you were baptized. So if you were not baptized, you couldn't be saved. So he believed in baptismal regeneration. But Campbell, in his rationalistic views, didn't believe that God intervened in salvation. He believed that was man, that you just believe the gospel and you're saved. You're not born again. You assent to the gospel and you're saved. So it's really like you just joining a group and becoming part of it and assenting to the belief. Campbell also rejected the Old Testament, and Campbell rejected any confessions of faith. He didn't believe we should express what we believed in confessions or Baptist Faith and Message or anything like that. New Hampshire Confession, Philadelphia Confessions. He did not believe in confessions of stating your beliefs and organizing around him. Now you can see what that can lead to. That can lead to people believing anything, and that leads to serious division. So this was obviously a controversy, along with the anti-missions movement, was a controversy that caused division among Baptists. Now, in the midst of all this, the Southern Baptist Convention splits and becomes distinctive from the Triennial Convention. There are three factors that led to the schism between the Baptists in the South and the Triennial Convention. Number one was a disagreement over methods of organization. Number two, problems in home mission work. And number three, the slavery controversy. Let's discuss the methods of organization first. One of the reasons that the Southern Baptist Convention, or the Southern Baptist split from the Triennial Convention, was because Southerners preferred the convention method, while the Northerners preferred the societal method. One of the reasons for this probably was because traveling in the South was over longer distances. In other words, you had a longer way to travel from the Appalachians to Charleston, and longer distances from Georgia to Raleigh and Virginia. Those are long distances to travel. In the North, between Baptists, the distances were shorter, so it was more, could foster more of a society approach where a person could travel from and get support, where in the South, conventions where you meet one time a year or one time every 3 years, where people sent delegates and met one time, was a lot easier to support missions. So this is why Southerners probably preferred convention model, and Northerners preferred the societal. So Southern Baptists, or Southern Baptists in the South, disagreed with the Triennial Convention over those methods of organization. Another problem occurred in the South concerning their membership in the Triennial Convention, occurred over the problems in home missions. Baptists in the South did not believe they received their fair share of home mission money. In other words, most of the Triennial Convention were Northern Baptist. So the South felt like that most of the money that they gave to the Northern Baptist or the Triennial Convention, not much of that money came back to the South for planting churches there. The Baptists in the South also believed that personnel in the Southern missions field lacked because the North didn't send missionaries to the South. So Southern Baptists in the South objected to the Triennial Convention because they didn't feel like they were sending enough personnel to the South. Another problem in the home missions group was few Northerners wanted to work in the South because of slavery. They disagreed with slavery, the climate. There were longer distances away from their family if they came from the North to the South, and a lack of welcome in the South for people from the North to serve down there. So the other factor that we need to talk about, though, that caused the division between the Baptists in the South from the Triennial Convention was slavery. John Rolfe stated this distinction in a very good way. Rolfe said slaves came over here, and even white slaves, and even slaves that came out of England were indentured servants. And that meant that they sold themselves to work, 7 years or 5 years to a person. And when they worked, that person gave them a place to live, and they worked as an indentured servant. But after 5 years, their service was broken, and if they wanted to stay on, they had to re-sign up, or they could go and they were free. But what happened with the black slaves is often slaves were sold in Africa to slave traders, Portuguese slave traders most of the time, and these slaves were sold in Europe to people, and these slaves were sold in America to people, and when these slaves were sold, because they were essentially captured, sometimes by their own people in Africa, and sold to Portuguese slave traders, these slaves became perpetual slaves. In other words, they were not indentured; they just kept them all their lives, which was really against the law. In other words, even in the New Testament, we do not see slavery. The New Testament and the Old Testament, it was against the law to steal a person from another country and make them become a slave. Again, they could hire out as an indentured servant because they didn't pay people a salary like they do now. So if you worked for somebody, you became their servant, but you somewhat contracted in that way and become an indentured servant. But some of the Southerners there didn't treat their slaves that way. They just made them lifelong slaves and never freed them. There was no way for freedom. So this began to develop in the South, where you had lifetime slaves who were bound and could never become free. There are two pieces of legislation that made this problem worsen in the government. Through the South, lobbying the federal government, they made a law or passed a law that a child born of a slave mother took the status of the mother and was not freeborn. So when children were born of a slave mother, they became slaves. They were not free. Although they were born in America, they were not free. So that meant that if they had babies, then they would continue on as slaves. The other piece of legislation was if slaves were baptized, that didn't alter their condition as a person, or the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. In other words, the person that was baptized didn't lose its slave status or their slave status. If you were baptized, you still remained a slave, and there's no way out of becoming a slave. So in the Carolinas and Georgia, many Baptists were slave owners. Richard Furman was. So this division of slavery was a problem between Baptists in the South and Baptists in the North. So the Triennial Convention was trying to solve this controversy, and so they began to have efforts of neutrality. The North agreed that it would be neutral on this issue, while lots of abolitionists were in the North who wanted to abolish slavery. If they participated in the Triennial Convention, they would remain neutral even though they're abolitionists. Well, two final straws caused the division. Number one was the Georgia test case. In other words, folks in Georgia didn't trust this neutrality that they agreed about in the North, so they introduced a test case to the Home Mission Board by appointing a slave owner named James E. Reeve for appointment as a home missionary. So they were going to test the Triennial Convention to make sure they would stay neutral, even though some abolitionists up there wanted to abolish slavery. They were to make sure that the Triennial Convention would stay neutral, so they actually introduced a slave owner to be appointed as a missionary in the Triennial Convention to see if the convention would actually approve him. And so they gave that appointment to James E. Reeve, and the end result was the board declined to act. They just didn't act on it. So one way or another, they didn't act. So that didn't solve anything. In fact, it made the people in the South feel like that they were, while the board didn't act, the Triennial Convention didn't act on that, they felt like they were being rejected. The other final straw was the Alabama resolutions. The Alabama Baptists sent an inquiry to the Triennial Convention asking if slave owners could be appointed. J.B. Taylor looked immediately toward immediate separation because, again, the Northern Baptists didn't act on it at all, and not much was said. At the same time, J.L. Waller was wanting to preserve the Union. So they were arguing there, based on these resolutions. Argument was going on in the Triennial Convention, and one man, J.B. Taylor, was crying for separation, and one man named J.L. Waller was calling for preservation. Well, in the midst of all that, the Virginia Baptists called for a consultative meeting in Augusta. So they wanted to come together and have a consultative meeting in Augusta over this issue. So they did. They came together in Augusta, and Francis Wayland addressed the convention and set the stage for the division between the Triennial Convention and the Southern Baptist. The principal architect and the first president was William Bullen Johnson. And Richard Furman was also influential in this. And Johnson gave an address at this Augusta meeting and gave several points there that was the reason for division. Off of those points, the Southern Baptist Convention was established and separated from the Triennial Convention, and that was the beginning of our Southern Baptist Convention.